One of the big parts in workplace violence threat assessment in particular is trying to understand the difference between the different kinds of threats that we experience and how likely they are to be carried out versus face saving. And Jacques, I'm sure in the HR space that you've worked in, you've encountered these every day, if not several
Oh,
times.
absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, there was another, as we're setting the groundwork, I did want to offer one other thing I want us to keep in mind.
Mhm.
Brian and I and our team at DPREP, we do some wonderful training on compassion fatigue. And certainly since the pandemic, since the events of 2020, that is more relevant. And so please see Bethany and ask more about that. But one of the things that we underscore in that training on compassion fatigue that prior to the pandemic, there were approximately 1/3 of the workforce that was experiencing varying degrees of mental wellness issues, we'll call them. Since 2020, that percentage has increased from 30% to over 90%. So let me say that again, over 90% of the workforce in the public space, private sector space, globally, are experiencing varying degrees of mental wellness issues. And so I put that in the space, and this is complementary to what Brian is sharing, because we get to really lean into that emotional intelligence foundation of a perspective and being self-aware and socially or situationally aware, because people are not coming into us in a vacuum. Humans are coming to us with all of their human frailties and with all their human conditions. And so we need to be very, very mindful. And so the interventions and strategies that we put in place are very human centric and really deep in both compassion fatigue, emotional intelligence, and trauma informed responses.
Yeah, perfect, Jacques. And this idea of holding on to past grievances and injustices, how people, it really leans into that cumulative effect of these behaviors, how things build over time, and how that creates these moments of potential escalations to violence. And that's very much part of the case that we'll look at today. So, without further ado, we'll show you this case, and then we're going to walk through a couple pieces of the fact pattern. And then we want to drop into an interactive space where Jacques and I can share some ideas that we have and also hear from you. So, let
Let's
me.
roll the tape.
Yeah.
All right, order 27.
Hey, dumbass. I don't know how hard your job is, but I ordered fries. Do you see any fries? I don't.
You need to leave.
Oh, yeah. I'll leave. I'll leave. I'll leave.
Part of our book that we're almost done with. It's been a little longer than we anticipated, but in that workplace violence prevention plan writing, we have three great case studies, and this is one of them. And what we did with each case study is we really walked them through some details, a violent incident log, and then a threat assessment process, as well as a threat mitigation and management process. So part of our goal today was to show you one of these cases. And as we look at the summary here, this is what we're seeing from the case and the experience as we move forward. So we see some good examples of what was going on. Jacques, any things here that you'd highlight in terms of what stood out for you, kind of being a little newer to the case and seeing it?
As a matter of fact, yes. We know from a human resources management perspective that employers have an obligation to provide a work environment that is harassment free, discrimination free, and obviously free from any harm or danger to the employees. So, what stood out for me as I'm reading the case summary fact pattern, I'm noticing a couple things that this restaurant is in an economically depressed area, that there are a number of calls for service. There was nothing the employee did wrong, right? And that the employee followed proper protocol. Hey, there's this incident. Let me make an incident report. Let me report it to the police. One thing that's interesting, and I've noticed this a lot, particularly when I served as chief human resources officer in higher education as well as K-12, the employee releases his frustration through social media. And for me, that's feedback, because that's telling me, at least raising the question, what are the mechanisms for what are the regular feedback mechanisms within the organization? And it is interesting that this employee took to social media as opposed to working with his supervisor. And I'm wondering there, is there a history of either chronic noncompliance, chronic indifference? Is there something that makes the employee feel isolated and alone and feels as if that management won't support his feedback? And that's even though this is in a restaurant, I've had this, Brian, you and I've talked about this before. I've had this come up a number of times. Even as a middle school teacher, a student will bring a weapon to school. We are very, very heavy on disciplining that student. I think only in recent times that now we look up under the hood and say, well, what caused the student to bring the weapon? What was going on? Had the student made complaints before about bullying, about things impacting the student's safety? Did the student go to a teacher, faculty member, administrator, and not get the response that he or she or they were seeking, and so decided to take matters into their own hands? So that's what all jumped out at me at this fact pattern.
Yeah, I like all of those things, Jacques. I think one of the places that the California SB 553 is directing us is the violent incident log, and we filled out a demonstration of this. There's going to be, as this law comes into effect, one of the things that we've noticed, and part of why we did a membership organization was related to why this and how this process is going to develop over time. So one of the areas that we brought up, I think, during our first training was how do we create a process both for the employees when they're sharing that initial incident and then that formalization, if you will, of this final log.